a last meal at Pizza Hut. Final words lasting 3 minutes and 17 seconds. These were the final sensory experiences of Brandon Bernard before the federal government stopped his heart with lethal injection on December 10th, 2020. But this story doesn't begin with his death. It begins with a choice made by an 18-year-old that would echo through 2 decades of American justice. June 21st, 1999, Killeen, Texas. 2 Iowa youth ministers extend Christian charity to 5 teenagers asking for a ride. Within hours, Todd and Stacie Bagley are dead, shot in the head, then burned alive in their own car trunk. The flames that consumed them were lit by the youngest member of the group, not the mastermind who planned the robbery, not the shooter who pulled the trigger, but the teenager who struck the match that turned wounded victims into corpses. For 6 hours before their deaths, the Bagleys spoke through the rear panel of their car while trapped in that trunk. By the time of his execution, almost everyone involved wanted Brandon Bernard to live. 5 of the 12 jurors who sentenced him to death signed petitions begging for clemency. The lead prosecutor argued against his execution. Celebrity campaigns flooded social media. Federal judges wrote dissenting opinions. Even some of the victims' extended family members questioned whether his death served justice. The question wasn't guilt. Bernard admitted his role. The question was whether America should execute a man for a crime committed as a teenager, especially when that man had spent 2 decades becoming someone radically different from the boy who lit that fire. 21 years separated the teenager who poured lighter fluid on a car from the man who mediated disputes on death row, mentored younger inmates, and earned the respect of guards who had watched him transform. This transformation created an unprecedented moral dilemma. Should the federal government execute someone whose own victims' families were divided on his punishment? Should society kill a man who had become a force for peace in one of America's most violent environments? Should justice demand the death of Brandon Bernard? Or had Brandon Bernard already died somewhere in those 2 decades, replaced by someone worthy of life? His execution became the 9th federal killing in 2020, the first time in 130 years that federal inmates were executed during a lame duck presidency. But numbers don't capture the human cost of this decision, the moral complexity of his transformation, or the agonizing question that haunted everyone who knew his story. Brandon Bernard's final hours force us to confront the most fundamental questions about justice, redemption, and the weight of our choices. Can someone who commits evil as a teenager be executed as an adult for becoming good? Does society have the right to kill someone who is no longer the person who committed the crime? Is the purpose of justice to punish the past or protect the future? The answers died with Brandon Bernard, but his story and the uncomfortable questions it raises about mercy, justice, and the possibility of human transformation lives on. June 20th, 1999. Todd and Stacie Bagley were Christian youth ministers from Iowa, their hearts dedicated to guiding young souls toward salvation. Before moving to Iowa, Todd had been stationed at Fort Hood, where the couple attended Grace Christian Church and worked with a youth group in Texas. They had returned to this familiar ground not as soldiers or residents, but as servants of faith. The military town of Killeen, Texas sprawled around Fort Hood like a constellation of strip malls and gas stations, its rhythm dictated by the comings and goings of America's largest active-duty armored post. For the Bagleys, this landscape held memories of ministry, fellowship, and the sacred work of shepherding teenagers through the turbulent waters of adolescence. But on this sweltering Texas afternoon, their path would cross with 5 teenagers whose souls harbored darker intentions. The Bagleys were visiting relatives in the area to attend a church revival, carrying with them the same spirit of service that had defined their lives. The couple had stopped to use a payphone in Killeen, Texas, a mundane task that would become the fulcrum upon which their fate would turn. Todd, at 26, carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had served his country and found his calling in serving God. Stacie, 28, possessed a gentle strength that made her a natural mentor to young women seeking direction. Together, they represented everything good about faith in action, compassion without judgment, service without expectation. Brandon Bernard, 18, Christopher Andre Villalva, 19, Terry Terrell Brown, 17, Christopher Michael Lewis, 17, and Tony Sparks, 16, moved through Killeen streets that afternoon like sharks sensing blood in the water. 5 teenagers whose ages should have spoken of promise and possibility. but whose intentions that day would reveal the terrible capacity for evil that can lurk beneath youth's facade. What none of them knew was that the next few hours would seal the fate of 7 lives forever. The stage was set in the most ordinary of places. A gas station where travelers stopped for fuel and phone calls, where the mundane business of daily life intersected with the sacred work of ministry. It was here, in this unremarkable corner of Texas, that the final act of 2 devoted lives would begin. Born into a world where fathers disappeared and mothers worked multiple jobs just to survive, Bernard learned early that loyalty meant everything and tomorrow was never guaranteed. At 18, he was neither the smartest nor the strongest in his group, but he was the youngest, and in the brutal mathematics of street survival, that made him expendable. Bernard's childhood in Killeen had been shaped by the rhythms of military life. Fort had loomed over everything, a massive installation that brought transient families easy money and a constant undercurrent of violence that comes with training soldiers for war. For kids like Bernard, growing up in the shadow of the base meant learning to navigate a world where strength was respected and weakness was punished. His co-defendants painted a picture of a follower, not a leader. Christopher Villalva, 19, was the acknowledged ringleader, the one who made the plans and gave the orders. The others fell into line behind him, but Bernard occupied the lowest rung of the hierarchy. He was a kid who did what he was told, who proved his loyalty through action rather than words. Meanwhile, 600 miles north, Todd and Stacie Bagley were building a different kind of life. Their small Iowa congregation had sent them to Texas with prayer and financial support, believing their youth ministry could make a difference in a place where hope was in short supply. The couple had been married for 3 years, their relationship built on shared faith and a common desire to help young people find their way. Todd had grown up poor himself, the son of a single mother who worked factory jobs to keep food on the table. His own teenage years had been marked by minor scrapes with the law. Nothing serious, but enough to understand the path that led kids toward trouble. He'd found salvation in his early 20s, met Stacie at a church social, and together they discovered their calling working with teenagers who reminded them of their younger selves. The Bagleys saw something in troubled youth that others miss. Potential hidden beneath pain, diamonds waiting to be polished. They'd spent countless hours in juvenile detention centers, foster homes, and group homes, building relationships with kids who had been written off by everyone else. Their philosophy was simple. Every teenager deserved a chance, no matter how far they'd fallen. The irony was crushing. The very demographic the Bagleys had dedicated their lives to serving would become their killers. The teenagers they'd driven hundreds of miles to help would repay their kindness with bullets and fire. And the boy who would light their funeral pyre was exactly the kind of kid they'd spent their careers trying to save. On the evening of June 21st, 1999, these two worlds collided with devastating finality. The Bagleys, fresh from a successful revival meeting, were preparing to return to their temporary housing when they encountered a group of 5 teenagers. The meeting appeared random, but investigators would later discover the teens had been planning a robbery, looking for easy targets with out-of-state license plates and visible signs of wealth. The temperature had barely dropped below 90 degrees when Todd Bagley made the decision that would end 2 lives and destroy countless others. At approximately 9:30 p.m., he rolled down his window and agreed to give 5 teenagers a ride. Within minutes, the youth ministers from Iowa were staring down the barrel of a .22 caliber pistol. Christopher Villalva, the 19-year-old ringleader, had orchestrated the encounter with chilling precision. He'd spotted the Bagleys' Iowa license plates hours earlier, identifying them as perfect targets. Outsiders with money, likely carrying cash, and far from anyone who might come looking for them quickly. The plan was simple. Rob them, take their car, and disappear into the Texas night. The gun appeared without warning. Todd, behind the wheel, felt the cold metal press against his temple as Villalva slid into the passenger seat. The other teenagers piled into the back, their faces a mixture of excitement and terror. Stacie, sitting in the front passenger seat, began to pray aloud, her voice steady despite the weapon now pointed at her husband's head. "Drive," Villalva commanded, his voice carrying the false bravado of someone trying to convince himself he was in control. Todd complied, his hands trembling on the steering wheel as he navigated the familiar streets of Killeen under the most unfamiliar circumstances of his life. The teenagers directed him toward the outskirts of town, past the strip malls and fast food restaurants, toward the desolate areas where military training exercises had left the landscape scarred and empty. As they drove, the dynamic in the car shifted. Brandon Bernard sat in the back seat, watching his life change with every mile they traveled. At 18, he was the youngest of the group, caught between childhood and adulthood, between following orders and making his own choices. He would later claim he never intended for anyone to die, but intentions matter little when guns are drawn and desperation takes hold. The car eventually stopped on a remote stretch of road near Fort Hood. The teenagers forced Todd and Stacie out of the vehicle, their hands shaking as they complied with increasingly frantic demands. The youth ministers, who had spent their careers defusing tense situations with troubled teenagers, tried to establish human connection with their captors. "We have families who love us," Stacie said, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "We have people who are expecting us to come home." Todd tried a different approach, drawing on his experience with at-risk youth. "Whatever you're going through, whatever brought you to this point, it doesn't have to end this way." But the teenagers were too far down the path to turn back. The presence of the gun had changed everything. Once weapons are drawn, every decision becomes a matter of life and death. And teenagers are not equipped to make those kinds of choices. Villalba ordered the couple into the trunk of their own car. The Bagleys complied, their voices growing muffled as the lid closed above them. For the next 6 hours, they would remain trapped in that metal coffin, talking to their captors through the rear panel, pleading for their lives, sharing stories about their families, their faith, their work with young people. The teenagers drove aimlessly through the night, uncertain what to do next. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, taken captives they couldn't release. The Bagleys' voices from the trunk served as a constant reminder of their humanity, making it impossible to forget that they were dealing with real people with real lives. As dawn approached, the group made their way to Fort Hood Military Reservation, federal land where military personnel conducted training exercises. Christopher Villalba made the decision that would seal everyone's fate. He opened the trunk, looked down at Todd and Stacie Bagley, and shot them both in the head with his .22 caliber pistol. The youth ministers, who had spent their final hours trying to convince 5 teenagers to choose a different path, died instantly. But Brandon Bernard's role in the crime was just beginning. As the group prepared to flee the scene, Villalba turned to the youngest member of their group and gave him a final order: destroy the evidence. Bernard, armed with matches and cigarettes, set the car on fire. The flames consumed the vehicle, burning the bodies of Todd and Stacie Bagley beyond recognition. What Bernard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Stacie Bagley was still alive when he lit that fire. The autopsy would later reveal that while Todd had died instantly from his gunshot wound, Stacie had survived the bullet to her head. She was unconscious but breathing when the flames began to consume the car. She died not from the gunshot, but from smoke inhalation and burns. That single fact would haunt Bernard for the rest of his life and complicate his legal case immeasurably. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but his actions had directly caused Stacie Bagley's death. He was neither the mastermind nor the shooter, but he was unquestionably a killer. The burned-out shell of the Bagley's car was discovered by military personnel conducting routine training exercises on Fort Hood the morning of June 22, 1999. The vehicle was still smoldering, its interior completely destroyed, its license plates melted beyond recognition. Inside, investigators found 2 bodies burned so severely that initial identification was impossible. The discovery triggered a massive federal investigation. Because the crime had occurred on federal property, the FBI took immediate jurisdiction, bringing vast resources to bear on what was initially classified as a double homicide. Special Agent David Maurer, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau, was assigned as lead investigator. Within hours, the FBI had identified the victims through dental records and determined they were not military personnel. Todd and Stacie Bagley had been reported missing by their church friends in Killeen, who had expected them to return the previous evening. The investigation that followed would prove that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces that skilled investigators can follow. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A convenience store clerk in Killeen remembered serving 5 teenagers late on the evening of June 21st. 1999. They had been acting nervous, talking loudly about having taken care of business, and one of them had been carrying what appeared to be a church pamphlet. Security footage from the convenience store provided the first clear images of the suspects. The teenagers had made no attempt to conceal their faces, apparently unaware that their crime would trigger a federal investigation. Within 24 hours, local law enforcement had identified all 5 suspects through school records and previous arrests. The arrests came swiftly. Christopher Villalba was taken into custody at his apartment, where agents found clothing that tested positive for gunpowder residue. Brandon Bernard was arrested at his mother's house, where he had been sleeping when FBI agents arrived at dawn. Bernard's arrest was notably different from the others. While his co-defendants had attempted to flee or destroy evidence, Bernard had simply gone home and gone to bed. When agents woke him up, he was confused and disoriented, asking repeatedly what was happening. The physical evidence against Bernard was overwhelming. Forensic analysis revealed that the fire had been started with matches, and Bernard's fingerprints were found on a matchbook discovered near the crime scene. But Bernard's cooperation with investigators set him apart from his co-defendants. While the others invoked their right to remain silent, Bernard spoke freely about the events, admitting to lighting the fire and expressing what appeared to be genuine remorse. The federal charges came down like a hammer. All 5 teenagers were charged with carjacking resulting in death, a federal capital offense that carried the possibility of the death penalty. Bernard's age became crucial. At 18, he was legally an adult under federal law, making him eligible for the death penalty. The trial of Brandon Bernard began on June 12, 2000, in the federal courthouse in Houston, Texas. The case that would determine whether an 18-year-old boy would live or die played out in a sterile courtroom filled with families destroyed by violence, government lawyers seeking justice, and a jury of 12 ordinary citizens tasked with making an extraordinary decision. Assistant U.S. Attorney Paul Coggins opened the prosecution's case with devastating simplicity. He didn't need to prove that Bernard had masterminded the crime or pulled the trigger. He only needed to prove that Bernard's actions had directly caused Stacie Bagley's death during the commission of federal crime. The prosecution's case was built on irrefutable scientific evidence. Dr. William Gormley, the forensic pathologist, testified that Todd Bagley had died instantly from his gunshot wound. But Stacie Bagley's death was different. The bullet that struck her head had not been immediately fatal. She had been unconscious, but alive when Bernard set the car on fire. She died from smoke inhalation and burns, not from the gunshot. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Gormley explained that Stacie Bagley had literally been burned alive. Bernard's actions had directly caused her death. He hadn't fired the gun, but he had killed her just as surely as if he had pulled the trigger. Defense attorney Robert Owen faced an impossible task. His client had confessed to actions that had caused an innocent woman's death. The evidence was overwhelming, and the federal government was seeking execution. Owen's strategy was to humanize Bernard, showing the jury he was more than just a killer, a young man who had made a terrible mistake. Owen called witnesses who testified about Bernard's troubled childhood, his lack of prior violent crime, painting a picture of a follower caught up in events beyond his control. The defense's most powerful argument was Bernard's age. At 18, his brain was still developing, his judgment still forming. Owen argued that Bernard's youth should warrant life imprisonment rather than death. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. Coggins reminded the jury that Bernard's age had not prevented him from making a choice when Christopher Villalba handed him the matches. He had looked at the car containing 2 unconscious human beings and decided to light on fire. The jury deliberated for just over 4 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The penalty phase began immediately, where Bernard's fate would truly be decided. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their recommendation: death. The judge accepted their recommendation and sentenced Brandon Bernard to death by lethal injection. As the sentence was read, Bernard showed no emotion, sitting quietly with his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the floor. He was 19 years old, sentenced to die for a crime committed at 18. The Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, became Brandon Bernard's entire world on August 15, 2000. His cell was a concrete box measuring 7 feet by 12 feet, containing a narrow bed, a small desk, a toilet, and a sink. He would spend 23 hours a day in this space, allowed out only for 1 hour of exercise. This was his life until the day the government would execute him. But something unexpected happened during those 21 years. Brandon Bernard began to change. The transformation was gradual but profound. Prison stripped away pretense, forcing him to confront who he really was. The solitude and reflection of death row became a crucible that burned away the confused, frightened teenager and revealed something different underneath. Bernard found religion, earned his GED, and began mentoring younger inmates. Guards at Terre Haute noticed a change. He became respectful, helpful, a mediator between conflicting inmates rather than a source of tension. He had no disciplinary violations, no instances of violence, no indication that he posed a danger to anyone. Perhaps most remarkably, Bernard reached out to the families of his victims through intermediaries, expressing genuine remorse and asking for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. 21 years in prison had given him something that 18 years of life had not: perspective. He understood the magnitude of what he had done, the lives he had destroyed, the pain he had caused. As his execution date approached, something unprecedented began to happen. The jurors who had sentenced him to death began speaking out, arguing that his execution should be commuted to life imprisonment. Angela Moore, the jury foreperson, became particularly vocal, arguing they had been given incomplete information about Bernard's role in the crime. Celebrity supporters, including Kim Kardashian West, joined the cause, but the federal government remained unmoved. The question that haunted everyone was simple: what purpose would be served by executing Brandon Bernard, who was no longer the confused teenager who had lit those matches in 1999? December 10, 2020, Federal Correctional Complex, Terre Haute, Indiana. After 21 years, 4 months, and 25 days on death row, Brandon Bernard's time had finally run out. The Supreme Court had denied his final appeal just hours earlier, and President Trump had refused to commute his sentence. The federal government was prepared to carry out the execution of a man who had committed his crime as an 18-year-old. The condemned man's last meal was delivered at noon: a meat lover's pizza and a chocolate brownie. He ate slowly, savoring flavors he would never taste again, talking quietly with the guards who had watched over him for 2 decades. There was no bravado, no anger, just quiet acceptance of what was about to happen. As evening approached, Bernard's family was allowed a final visit. His mother, sister, and several cousins gathered in a small visiting room, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. They had watched Bernard grow from a confused teenager into a thoughtful adult. And now, they were watching him prepare to die for a crime he had committed half a lifetime ago. At 8 p.m., Bernard was moved to the death chamber. The room was small and sterile, dominated by a gurney with leather restraints. Witnesses sat behind a glass partition. Representatives from the victims' families, members of Bernard's family, media representatives, and government officials. The atmosphere was tense, somber, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Bernard was strapped to the gurney, for lines inserted by medical personnel. He looked toward the witness room, his eyes finding his family members, offering them a small nod of acknowledgement. When given the opportunity to make a final statement, his voice was steady, clear, carrying the weight of 21 years of reflection. "I'm sorry." That's the only word that I can say that completely captures how I feel now and how I felt that day. I'm sorry to the Bagley family. I'm sorry to my own family. I'm sorry to everyone I've hurt. The execution began at 9:27 p.m., the first drug-induced unconsciousness within seconds. At 9:42 p.m., 15 minutes after the process began, the prison physician pronounced Brandon Bernard dead. He was 40 years old, having spent more than half his life on death row. The question that haunted the case for 21 years remained unanswered. Had justice been served? The federal government had executed not the 18-year-old who had committed the crime, but the 40-year-old he had become. Whether that distinction mattered was a question that will continue to divide legal experts, ethicists, and ordinary citizens long after Bernard's death.